I'd like to pass it over to our speaker, Dr. Mirza Galib. Dr. Mirza Galib is a postdoctoral research scientist at the Predictive Materials Modeling Laboratory at the University of Louisville, Kentucky. He's completed his PhD in chemistry from the University of Calgary in Canada. And prior to this, his current engagement, he worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, and as a postdoctoral research associate at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Washington. Without further ado, Dr. Mirza Galib, the floor is yours.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. The organizers who organize such a very good events, and thanks for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. I was listening part of the last talk by Dr. Astor Talib, and it was amazing. I mean, I will concur some of the things that he was trying to say. So my talk will be how we can connect religion, mostly Islam, with others, with the seculars and the non-Muslims in the public sphere. And I'll focus a little bit what Muslim academics can do. Now, I'll just request everybody to pay attention that I'm not a social scientist. I'm not trained as that. I'm trained in chemistry and natural science. So I have natural interest in theology. So a lot of talk will be, I mean, when I use the social science terminologies, that will be a layman terminology. And more or less, I'll try to focus from the theological sides a little bit more. As Jafar was talking, the theme of this session, secular democracy, liberalism, and religion in the public sphere. And the reason why this has been chosen, because in the public sphere, in many of the Muslim countries, there is a tension between the seculars and the Islamists or the Muslims. And this conflicting nature is coming from sometimes both sides. I mean, we can talk a lot that which side is more responsible, but I think this is inherent in both sides. Some secular and liberal thoughts view religion as too conservative and outdated in this modern era. And they think that they should not be in the public sphere at all. So there is one of the very extreme view in one side. And similarly, some Islamic and Muslim views also see the secular and liberal thought as kufr, and its existence is completely unwelcomed in the public sphere. How much you can reduce that from the public sphere, that should be the maqasid. That is one way we can think, and some of the sect within Islam also thinks. And that creates an head-to-head tension. So that's some kind of problem statement. So today, in this talk, I will try to discuss a little bit on this nature of this conflict between the Islamic and liberal thoughts. And I will mostly focus on the theoretical position of Islam, that how much coexistence Islam itself theoretically encourage. If you read it within the Quran and Hadith, if you look into the way Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam understood and implemented and interpreted this deen, and there within the inherent Islamic position, how much this coexistence is welcomed. And finally, I'll try to point out some important aspects where we, the Muslim academics, can contribute to bridge this gap and to make a peaceful world. In other words, to understand Islam perfectly and to propagate that in a perfect way. So let us start from the very first point. This conflict, that religious conservatism versus the secular liberalism, is actually coming from one single point. And that single point is where we get our values or ethics from. I mean, if we just ask the question that what is right and what is wrong, what I should do and what I should avoid, what should I take and what should I delete, these questions of value and ethics, when it comes from faith, it follows a specific pattern, and when it comes from a secular liberal idea, that comes from a different pattern. Now, within the faith, within the religion, it comes from faith that I believe was coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the truth, the capital truth. And I follow that. I do not question that, the validity, what comes from faith within the rational framework. But within a secular liberal format, we generally put that to the empirical evidence. And I mean, I need to put this in this way, that even though we look into the West and see that this is a secular liberalism, however, it was originated from Christianity, and still there is a lot of impact on the Christianity. When if you look into the conservative and liberal politics, the way evolving in the West, there are many issues that actually still centered around the ethical point of the Christianity. So that's a different things. But any liberal and secular thought, even though that originated from the faith-based moral values, but when it deviates from that, it actually more moving to this empirical evidence, that we can do these rational arguments, can look into the evidences and find out the moral values. And within the faith, within the religion, when you say that this is connected to the God, it's actually completely two different framework. And that's the source of the tension between these two thoughts. Now, there are two important points in here. The first point is that neither faith nor the empirical evidence that can be convincing to everybody at the same time. I mean, faith is not convincing to everybody because different people has different faith, different religions, and therefore the argument within one faith has nothing to do with the people with other faith. From that point of view, sometimes we may think that empirical evidences are better and it can convince more people, but this is not true, because human knowledge and its development at the end of the day is limited, and we cannot make everything like 2 + 2 = 4. The problem is multidimensional, and it has long-term and mid-term effect that we do not understand very well. And that's why when you argue within the empirical evidences, we argue many different ways and we come to many different conclusions. And that's why whether we go through faith or we go through the empirical evidences, either can be relatively wrong. I mean, faith can be relatively wrong in this way that one conclusion drawn within one faith will not have any acceptability from the other faith. So that's relatively wrong, because nobody can agree with the same right thing. And the similar thing happens within the empirical evidence. We can argue, we can rationally derive, but at the end of the day, there is no guarantee this is the absolute truth and it will be convincing to all. And this is why we should change our focus from the question of what is the absolute truth and imposing that on everybody. I mean, this is every moral group tries to do, that I know the absolute truth and I put that on everybody, either by crude means or by a smart, intelligence way. But whatever it is, when we talk about this coexistence, then the more important question is that how can you ensure a peaceful coexistence between various value systems? Right? There will be always people from different faith and different values. The question is how do you live together? How do you respect each other? How do you make boundary? And how can you make pacts so that we can act together within a society, within a state, within a global system? So that should be the most important question. And when we change the question to there, then it's become much better to solve it. So having said that, now I'll be looking into Islamic theoretical framework, that how much Islam appreciates this coexistence, Islamic value system and Islamic basic understanding. Now, before going to coexistence, we need to be very careful about when we think this line that Islam has some resistance to coexistence too, and we need to understand that perfectly. And that resistance comes from this fact that Islam has its own value system, and it's highly sensitive to preserve that value system. And that's why we talk about inclusion. That does not mean losing own brand and merging into others, right? So the form of inclusion that Islam talks about, it does not eliminate diversity. It wants to retain its own value system. It's not interested to mix that with others and preserve that. And having retained its own identity and brand, then Islam is open to coexistence. And this phenomena that Islam has its own value system and Islam wants to preserve that is very well established within Islam. I'm just quoting one from Quran and one from Hadith. This is a verse from, excuse me, Surah Al-Ma'idah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Al-yawma akmaltu lakum deenakum wa atmamtu alaykum ni'mati wa raditu lakumul islam adina. That today I have perfected for you your religion and completed my favor upon you. So one explanation of this verse is that Islam has a closed value system. It has all the things that it needs, and it's a complete code of life. And to develop the morality, moral understanding, and the legal rulings, and how we will be living a life in this dunya, right? Islam has all the answers. So there's a complete code of life. That's the more popular phrase, the way we understand Islam. So Islam has it. And then if you look into the hadith of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that whoever innovates into this matter of ours, that which does not belong to it, it will be rejected. So the idea is that it's complete. And the second point is that you should not import anything from outside into it. And that's why it doesn't want to change. It is what it is, and it's complete. It's coming from Allah. This is the truth, and that's all. So this is one important thing that we need to have in mind when we talk about this, how to make coexistence, how to peace, how to look into the liberal secularism and so on. But we should not forget that this is Islam, what it is. Now, the second point, despite of the fact that Islam has this sense of preserving its own value, and it defines its own value by itself, it's a complete loop by itself. But this does not mean, I will strongly argue, that this is not actually in contradiction with that Islam is interested in the coexistence with others. Even though apparently it looks that these two are binary and one conflicts with others, but it actually is not. And there I will point out three important points that what Islam is interested into. One important point is engagement, that Islam recognizes and appreciates moral values. Those originated outside Islam, and as long as it is moral according to the understanding of Islam. So Islam does not claim that all the morality coming from Islam, the people can independently think, and their fitra has an understanding of the morality. From this point of view, Islam actually sees that there is a set of universal morality that people can understand. There is. So I know that there is a lot of debate in social science about that, but that's the Islamic position, as I understand. Then the second point is the realism. That's I was saying before, that the question is not the absolute truth. The question is, how do we coexist, provided that in the society we will have different value system, different ethics system. And that's why Islam take a realistic position, that it pushes solving the question of absolute truth beyond faith to the next life. That this will not be solved in this dunya. People will not converge to one single faith. People will not be able to identify the truth in this world, finally, everybody, all together. Rather than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows people to decide their ways by themselves in this world. And Islam says that be respectful to each other. I'll give a very specific example from there. And the number three is treaty, the agreement between these groups, that Islam encourages coexistence through a commonly agreed upon norms. Now, we need to read these two sides at the same time, that Islam wants to preserve its own value, but at the same time, Islam is interested into coexistence through engagement, realism, and agreement with others. So I'll be just going through a little bit into each. If we look into first the engagement, that Islam recognizes and appreciates that morality can exist outside Islam. Islam is not the sole agent. Even though in one way, right, if you see that Adam alayhi salam was the first prophet and he gets the moral teaching from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this propagates somehow. So the origin goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but at the same time, at some point in the history, this can be disconnected and people can build his own morality from somewhere else, from his own thoughts, from empirical evidence and so on. And when Islam identifies the morality exists outside Islam, it is very happy to see that. And I'm giving one very specific example, that Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was part of a pact that stopped an inter-clan war in the pre-Islamic time. And later in his life, Rasulullah said about that fact that I witnessed a fact of justice in the house of Abdullah ibn Zudan that was more beloved to me than a herd of expensive red camels. So that's an Arabic metaphor to show that how important this is. And then Rasulullah says the most important thing, that if I were called to it now, in the time of Islam, I would respond. So Rasulullah is recognizing that these acts in the pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah, when some of the leaders of those society stand up for peace and stopping the war and sitting together and making a pact, Rasulullah is valuing that so much so that he's saying that if somebody is calling me for that good, even when I'm in Islam, I'll go there and I'll take a part in there. So that means he's saying that this is something moral, even though this was initiated by the people during the time of Jahiliyyah. So this supports our argument that Islamic value system is not a closed value system in the sense that there is no value outside Islam, and it's always conflicting with all others. It's not like that. So Islam recognizes that morality can exist outside in Islam, and we are very happy to see if that exists, and we can work together. And this actually gives us the window that different religions can build up a common morality where they agrees, and where they disagrees, that will be under the freedom of religion, that everybody can follow his own religion. Where they agrees, they will work together. And the same way, there might be the ways to find out common grounds between Islamists and the seculars, because there are many moral principles where we will be agreeing with each other. Now, if you look into the second point, where I'm talking this at realism, that even though Islam says what coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the absolute truth, and everything outside of it is false, in terms of true and false, Islam is very binary in there. But Islam very strongly recognizes two things. One, that since people will have different values, and everybody claims that he is the absolute truth, and if he denies everything with others, then that will create a chaos. And that's why we need a mutual coexistence so that we can honor each other. And when a truth honor a false, then you have to honor their false. And that comes with this coexistence. And Islam is happy to pay the price. And look at the verse of the Quran in Surah Al-An'am. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, do not insult those they invoke other than Allah. So the gods non-Muslims pray, those gods are false according to Islamic theology. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that do not insult them. So don't tell that they're false in front of their face. Do not make that a big thing that they get offended. Why? Because if you insult them, they can insult Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in back because they don't have ilm. And this will happen, right? If you have a different groups, they have a different value system, and one always says that you are wrong completely, and you say it in a way that you offend them, and they say it back, and that will make this chaos and problem. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving here is a solution that you don't need to compromise your truth. That's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying it. He's saying that what is truth, that truth, what is false, that is false. But when you are in the public sphere, when you react with each other, do not insult them. Give them some honor. Give the honor to their falsehood, even though you know in your heart that they're false, but give the honor, because that's necessary for the coexistence. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Summa ila rabbihim marji'uhum. Everybody will come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And fayunabbihum bima kanu ya'malun. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make them understand the right thing. So the solution of this conflict, that which is the absolute truth, that will be when we go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no way we can make that solution in this dunya. And that's why do not make a big deal in here. Do not insult them. So focus on coexistence. So this is not compromising the Islamic position that Allah is one God. He is the true God. It's not compromising that position. It's a realistic position that I believe in my religion, and I believe that your religion is false, but I'm not interested to offend you. I'm not interested to offend your value system, but I want to find out avenues so that we can exist together. So Islam has this realism. So this realism is the second point where we find out that Islam has an interest to coexist. And then third is the treaty, that when people are interested to make agreements and to live together, then Islam Islam shows its hands to them and says, "Oh, okay, come on, we are interested to live together." And in the modern time, this what we call that when you build a state, right? There is a social, right, social political norm, and different states have social political norms within the international law. I mean, even though people are very hypocrite to follow the international law, I think no mighty country actually follows morally international laws. But that's a different thing. But we have the norm that we can coexist with that, and Islam also honored that very strongly. And this is the verse from Surat Al-Mumtahina. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah does not forbid you from those who do not fight you because of religion and do not expel you from your homes, from being righteous toward them and acting justly. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually saying that in Allah yuhibbul muqsitin, the people who do the attitude with justness and rightness and kindness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love them. The only people who are expelled from this, those are the people who actually fight with you and expel you from your home and religion, who do oppression on you. So this means that if people are interested to follow some norm, do not interested to do oppression, and then we can all coexist together. And it is our religious duty to be nice to them when they follow these principles. So these three things is very important to understand the Islamic premises of coexistence, that why and how Islam is interested to see all the things outside of Islam and finding the avenues where we can work together, despite of the fact and understanding the first point that Islam has its own value system and is not interested to trade that. Islam always interested to preserve that, but after preserving that, is open the windows so that we can work together with others to build a coexistence public sphere. Now, the last point, what we can do in our time to promote this coexistence. And of course, the first point, we need a comprehensive and right and in-depth understanding of Islam, so that it's not too liberal that I compromise my theological framework, or making it completely non-inclusive and I undermine the very fundamental framework of Islam itself. So that balance is the most important thing. Now, the second point, excuse me, the second point, what I'll be saying, this is very consistent with what Dr. Astor Talukdar was saying, that we actually need a language that based on empirical evidence and rational arguments. So that's a little bit different than the theological language. And we need to, so I'll frame this way, that we need to translate the theological language, the faith-based language, into a rational language. Because the modern people understand more the empirical evidences. That's the academic language they talk about. This is very much different than the theological language. And that's why we need a translation, right? We don't need to change the value system of Islam. There is no need of that. It's complete. It's coming from Allah, is the truth. What we need is to translate the theological language into the language of our time, the rational and empirical language, so that we can reach more people, even who are outside of Islam, so that they understand how Islam thinks. They understand what is the framework of Islam consistently. Now, Islam has two parts. I mean, in many ways, we can do this classification. In one way, we can look into the part of the ibadah, the ritual ibadah, that talk about all the most important theological relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the other part is the muamalat, where we deal with the people, the society, the state, and other things. Now, when it comes to the ibadah part, the theological language is more rigid. And in there, our duty will be developing an internal consistency, right? So when we interpret the theological part, it will remain theological, but what this rational language will do, it will make it internally consistent, so that people, when read the interpretation and understanding, they will understand that one part of this is related to the other part. So for example, I give an example from my science part, that we have the framework of quantum mechanics and we have the framework of classical mechanics. In physics, those two are completely different, but they're consistent within it. So if you start with the fundamental assumption in the quantum mechanics, and if you solve the equation, you'll come to a conclusion. And if you start with the assumption of classical mechanics and you do solve the mathematics, you come to a completely different conclusion, right? Now, both are right in the sense that both follows different mathematical framework, but they're consistent to their own mathematical framework. So for the ibadah part, we need this, that we need to build up so that Islam is internally consistent to each other. When somebody read and see that these are the position of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they will understand why it is there, because one part of that is consistent to the other part of that. And somehow this goes to the maqasid al-sharia. There are many ways you can read maqasid al-sharia. In one way, you can read the maqasid al-sharia is understanding that Islam has an internal consistency and all those internal consistency converges to a bigger picture and higher objective. And that higher objective is the maqasid al-sharia. So that will be during for the part of ibadah. And then for the part of muamalat, this is more interesting because muamalat is dealing with many things that interacts our life every day. And modern people understand that, I mean, in a better way than the ibadah part. And for the muamalat part, we need to develop a communicative language for a broader audience so that they understand that the moral and ethical positions of Islam has a rational basis, has an empirical basis. And this is actually, I took the message from Dr. Asrar Talukdar's talk, that he was talking about many interesting positions of Islam, that these are the moral position inherent into Islam, and the Western crisis might need the solution, that Islam can offer something to those Western crises, but we need to develop the language that will be based on not only the theological language, but that will be based on a rational empirical language so that other people can understand. And the people who are well trained now in the academic world, in the different branches of the knowledge, especially in the social science and also in science, they have a lot of do in that category. So let's say I'm giving some examples, very simple examples, so that we can understand easily. So if I ask the question that why do Muslims fast, why we have the fasting in the Ramadan, we can just simply make a theological answer that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed this as an wajib, as a fard, and so we do. So that's the theological language. And that answer is the most important answer, no doubt. That's very strong, very powerful, but that's the theological language. Now, if you think into how to convert this into a more rational language, we do not need to build a medical reason, because the ibadah in Islam actually not coming for the health reason. That was not the underlying maqasid. So that will be a wrong way to go. And when you try to rationalize, many times we fall into this trap. So we need to be very careful about that. It is more related to the spiritual reason that, right, we need to be able to explain that how depriving the body from food and drink is related to the practice of controlling the nafs. That's the main important point that coming from the religious spirituality. But there is a point that we can translate the theological position into a rational and empirical evidences. And that will make a strong communication with the secular Muslims and the people outside of the Muslims. For example, I'm giving an example in the muamalat part. Islam prohibits interest-based transaction. This is haram. Riba, that's haram. Now, right, in the theological language, we can see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it is bad, so it is bad. Fine, that's fine for ibadah. But if we can develop a communicative language, then we need that why interest is bad for people, why interest is oppression to poor people. And within an economic framework, I need to show with empirical evidence that this has a bad consequences. And that theological language will not work. I need the people, right, who are trained in economics, who can understand the social consequences of this and look into from many different academic view and find out why interest bad. The Quran is giving the policy that your wealth should not be circulated among the rich. Now, why Quran is interested into distribution of wealth, right? We can explain that into a theological language, but at the same time, we can explain that in a rational language. And when Muslim academics stand up and take the tools of rational language without compromising the theological language, so this should be very clear that I'm not saying that we should abandon theological language because that's less important. No, theological language is important. That's the first thing. Because if we do not understand theological language, we do not understand our deen. But only the theological language should not be the end. We need to build a communicative language. Because when we have a communicative language, we can address broader people within the Muslim society who are more secular and liberal, within the practicing Muslim part of our mind that is logical and rational, and also to communicate with the people outside of Islam. And this is the duty of the Muslim academics in our time. And I will be, this is the end slide most probably, I'll be giving an example, just a flavor from a classic events that happened during the time of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that will give an idea that this communicative language is not a bidah, it's not a new thing, it's not the time, the need of our time. It was actually a necessary thing for all times. During the time of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in his Meccan life, when the persecution and oppression was very high in extreme form, a part of the companion of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam went from Mecca to Abyssinia, the king Najashi. And then there was a delegate from Mecca to advocate so that they can take them back to Mecca. And in the court of Najashi, the Muslims with Rasulullah, the part of the Sahaba, they went there, and the delegate from the Quraysh, they were just talking each other that why Muslims are there and why the king should give them back. And then the leader of the Muslim was Jafar ibn Abu Talib, and he gave a speech in there that is recorded in the history. And if you look into the speech, the way he described Islam, we'll see this flavor of communicative language, that how he was describing Islam. And this is important. This is really important because this is the early time of Muslims. So the early Muslims, the Sahaba, when they entered Islam, how they view Islam. What was that completely theological language? No, it was both theological and communicative language. Look, he's saying, "O king, we were a people in the state of ignorance and immorality, worshipping idols and eating the flesh of dead animals, committing all sorts of abomination and shameful deeds, breaking the ties of kinship, treating guests badly, and the strong among us exploited the weak. We remained in this state until Allah sent us a prophet." Look, he's starting with a prophet, but he's not starting, that was not his first statement. He's just creating the background that the life we are living was not good. It was not moral. And this immorality that he was pointing out, not in a theological language, he's making a language that can be shared by the other peoples. And now he's saying that why prophet is important for them. He commanded us to speak the truth, to honor our promises, to be kind to our relations, to be helpful to our neighbors, to cease all forbidden acts, to abstain from bloodshed, to avoid obscenities and false witness, not to appropriate an orphan's property, nor slander chaste women. He's talking about muamalat, because muamalat are more easy to connect to people. But he's not compromising ibadat, he's not compromising the tawheed. The monotheism is not excluded, right? But that is not the only thing he was talking about. So this is a classic example that a communicative language is important. And using a communicative language as a tools or explaining Islam within a communicative language is not a new need for our time. This was used by the early Sahaba. And this is not only important to me as that Jafar ibn Abu Talib was smart enough to describe Islam in such a language, but it was also important to me that this is how the early Muslim psychology saw Islam. They saw Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in this context, and they're the best generations to understand Islam. So we need to take the lesson from there and put that into the framework of our time and try to find out a way that how we can convert the religious language into an empirical rational language so that we can communicate effectively with our counterparts in the public sphere. And definitely that will enhance the coexistence of Islamists and the seculars in the public sphere to build a better peaceful society, state, and global order. And for that, we need the experts on various fields of theology, no doubt, because I said for the ibadah, we need the internal consistency, and we need very great scholars on aqidah, on fiqh, on maqasid, on akhlaq, and other things. And the same way, we need the expert in other branches of knowledge so that they cooperate without theological knowledge, can make self-consistent check between each other, and finally all together can build an understanding of Islam that is not compromising anything of its theology, but at the same time, translating that to an effective communication with others, to make a public sphere that will welcome everybody else for a peaceful coexistence. And now the people, right, in our time, who are academics, who have trained on social science, and other parts of academic knowledge, one way we can right, take the theological position from Islam that will be our inspiration, that will be our primary hypothesis. Then we should use all the academic tools and language that we are trained to develop that and communicate that to others. And that will definitely ease the current conflict that we have. So there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability of doing that. So with that prayer, I'll end my talk. Thank you for your time and listening, and I'll be very happy to listen to your discussion rather than questions. I'll welcome it. Everybody discuss with that. Thank you.